Alrighty. So now we have to figure out how we're going to build our client assets, how we're going to bundle in our JavaScript and CSS, in this case Sass, how we're going to be able to use ES 2015 features. We're going to be talking about optimization, extracting text, and we're going to just do some awesome stuff. So let's go ahead and start off with writing some code in our client. I'm going to create a new file called application.js, and this is going to be sort of the entry point to our client code. And in this, I'm going to do the same thing we did with server. I'm going to import bleh from shared test. And again, I'm just writing out a skeleton client application so we can watch it be built properly. And then we will, we'll move on and actually get Webpack to work. So we import bleh from shared test, which remember is the shared folder. Again, that's something Webpack's going to have to figure out. And then let's just invoke it. And we're going to be using Sass. And Sass is a CSS preprocessor. So we're going to right-click client, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new file called application.scss. And for this, I'm going to say body h1 color red, just some arbitrary Sass. So SCSS is that extension allows us to write Sass, and it's very similar to less, but it's more powerful. It's actually gaining a lot of traction these days. But now that we have application SCSS in, let's go back into application.js and let's import it. So I'm going to say import /application.scss. So this might be starting to feel a little weird. Especially if you guys aren't used to the whole module thing, the ES 2015 thing. Again, I have a series about this sort of stuff, but it's kind of weird including in this JavaScript file, this style sheet, which isn't even in CSS. The browser doesn't understand Sass. It's something we're gonna have to process, but we're importing it directly from a JavaScript file, and that's a very odd thing to do if you're not used to doing this sort of thing. But I guarantee you, this is. Throughout the series, you'll understand why this is now basically the way things are. It's the way we've sort of moved forward as an industry, sort of compartmentalizing our CSS into these little modules that are included by the JavaScript that requires them. And it's really, really nice. But yeah, so once you, kind of get your head around including CSS from JavaScript, which again seems really bizarre, let's go ahead and get started with how we're going to compile this. So like we usually do, we're going to need some packages. In order for Webpack to understand Sass, it's going to need a handful of packages. So we're going to do npm install --save dev. We're going to install the css-loader, the style-loader, the sass-loader, and we're also going to need a couple other loaders. We're going to need a URL-loader and a file-loader. So while these install, I'm going to hit enter. Let's talk about what each one of these does. The style loader includes style sheets on your page. If you include a style, it will be included on your web page. That's what the style loader does. CSS loader specifically loads CSS. So generally you pipe CSS into the style loader. The Sass loader compiles Sass into CSS. So generally you would use the Sass loader to compile Sass into CSS, put it into the CSS loader, which translates it into a CSS module, and then stuff it into the style loader, which will then include it onto your web page. Then we have the URL loader and the file loader. These are for things like if we have an image, a background image, or something of that nature that we include within our style sheet or within our JavaScript module. I mean, hey, what if we have a sound, for example? Well, we don't want to put our sounds and our assets in our public folder. We want to include our sounds directly from JavaScript. And that's what the URL loader and file loaders do. So they're really, really powerful. There is always pay attention to your peer dependencies. I often forget peer dependencies, which is why I always like scrolling through this list to make sure I have all of them. Remember, a peer dependency is a dependency of a dependency. So for example, our Sass loader needs Sass to be installed, but it doesn't install it itself. It gives you the opportunity to install whatever version you want. So in this case, we have to now npm install node-sass save dev. Otherwise, our Sass loader won't work because that's not a met peer dependency. But once we do that, that error should go away. So this will bring down a awesome Sass compiler, a native Sass compiler, super fast, super amazing, and I don't know. I was a big less fanboy for a very, very long time, since like 2009, but for Sass, I just have grown to prefer that. Anyway, we now no longer have any unmet dependencies, and that's what we like to see. So now we have all of our loaders. Let's write our config. Actually, I do kind of want to test a loader. I don't know what I'm going to do, how to do that. I do want to test the file loader. Let's bring in a an image, just an arbitrary image. So I'm just going to, let's see here. I'm just going to pop over to a site that I like for just background patterns, just for test stuff. Subtlepatterns.com. You can use all of these patterns as long as you credit them. And I'm just going to search for dark. And then I'm going to, which one do I like? Binding dark looks cool, so I'll download it. So I have binding dark. I'm going to open up the folder. And I'm going to open that up in 7-zip, go to binding dark, and then I'm going to move that over, and I'm going to right-click client, add a new folder called images. I'm going to open this up by Explorer by right-clicking and saying reveal in Explorer, and come back over here, and then I'm just going to drop binding dark and, or how about both these? Why not? So we'll do that. And then we'll come back into our application as CSS, and for our body, we'll give it a background of URL, images, binding dark. Let's do the 2x for this. Binding dark 2x.png. And of course, one of their stipulations is that you credit it in the source. So I will just throw that off, throw that comment there, because I highly encourage people not to do illegal things. And subtle patterns is awesome, and I highly support them. Anyway, so now that we have that, we can also test our file loader, and you guys will see an example of how Webpack will actually take this. Isn't that really cool? It'll actually take this image in our source folder, and it'll include it in the package, just all automatically. It's magic. But anyway, let's go ahead and start our Webpack client config. Oh, before we do that, we should probably add repeat on this because it is a pattern. All right, to start off our config, let's add a new file called webpack.client.js. And we're going to follow the exact same pattern as our webpack.server. So I'll type that out again. Function create config is debug. And I'll copy over that comment I had previously. So we're going to have webpack config, return, and then end that there. And then we're going to say module.exports equals create config true, and then module exports.create equals create config. So now we have our create config, and we can conditionally do our production or our development build. Now, I am going to do something weird. I am going to include my path, like usual, require path. But I'm also, above create config, I'm going to say const dir name equals path.resolve./ and this is a bit of a weird one. The reason why I'm not using __ dir name in this file, the reason I'm not doing that is there's a little bit of an oddity when we are using Webpack hot middleware on the server to provide our built assets for in development. There's a bit of an oddity of how __ dir name gets compiled by Webpack. So as a result, I found a workaround where I can resolve the absolute directory to this path right here. Instead of using __ dir name, I can say path.resolve./ and so as a result, we can now use that properly. So it's just an oddity with Webpack that because of the way we set things up. It actually won't, the dir name thing doesn't matter if we invoke Webpack from gulp or from the command line, but it will matter in a couple videos where we invoke Webpack from the server. So just keep that in mind. It's just a weird thing. If you're not using Webpack dev hot middleware, you won't need to do this. I'll bring this up again once we do the middleware, so you'll have more of a context of why you have to do that. Okay, so in create config, we have a bunch of stuff that we need to do. First of all, our dev tool. Let's go ahead, and I'm not doing the dev tool in the Webpack config. I'm making a variable out of it, and you'll see why. I'll say dev tool equals isDebug question mark eval source map, otherwise source map. So what's going on here? Well, eval source map is a method of doing source maps that uses eval, the function eval, that is super fast. And I'll show you guys exactly why it's super fast once we get this build working. Whereas source map is a slower way to use to get source maps, but it's production ready. Whereas eval source map is super fast, but only for development. Source map is super slow, but for production. So that's why we're doing the change here. Now, why didn't we use eval source map for the server? Well, the reason why is because source map support, remember that package we used to bring source map support into Node? It's not compatible with eval source maps because there's no way to get that to work. So that's why we just used the slow source maps for our server. Next up, I'm going to preemptively do something. I'm going to say const plugins equals empty array, but we're not going to touch this quite yet. We will in a moment. Then I'm going to do something weird. I'm going to say const CSS loader equals test.css money. Loader is style exclamation point CSS. And then I'm going to say const Sass loader equals test on SCSS. Money loader is style CSS Sass. And that's going to look a little weird. Why are we making our loaders here instead of inside the Webpack config? Well, the reason why is you'll see this. When we do production builds, we're actually going to be using different CSS loaders. We're going to use different style loaders. We're going to use a special plugin called extract text. And you'll see why we need that later. But for now, just know that we have these aliased out instead of putting them down here because they might change depending on if isDebug is set to true or not. But we won't mess with changing them quite yet. The next thing is the same sort of deal, my entry. So I'm going to say app entry equals, and it's going to be an array of source client application.js. Remember that source client application.js right there? That's our entry point. But why am I aliasing this out? Well, same thing. We're going to be altering this in a couple videos depending on some conditions. So I need this out on its own variable so that I can do that. Why is it an array? For the same reason. We're going to be using the entry point as an array of files, of chunks, so that we can add additional files into our entry point depending on if we're in debug or if we're not in debug. So just like for example, inside of our Webpack server, we could have specified this entry point as an array if we wanted to. But we didn't because we're only loading in one file at any time. However, we might be loading in different files depending on if isDebug is set to true or not. So that's why we have that aliased out. All right, let's build our configuration, or at least what we have so far. I'm going to say devtool is devtool. So again, our devtool is set by isDebug, so that's why it's a variable. I don't like cluttering up my my Webpack config with things that can change, whether or not isDebug is set to true. That's why I take everything that can change and I put it at the top so that I only have to mess with that. Makes the code a lot cleaner. Now the entry point, we are going to be doing 2 entry points. Right now we're going to do one, but in a moment we're going to be doing another. So I'm making entry an object. If you make entry an object, you have multiple entry files, which means Webpack is going to make multiple files. Now for now, we're just going to make one. This will make sense in a moment, probably in the next video. We're going to say application is app entry. So again, I could have done entry is app entry, but since we're going to be modifying this in the next video, I decided to make it an object already. Again, the configuration options are crazy. It just takes time to get used to them. I hope I'm helping somewhat help with the mystery of all these random, seemingly random things that can be an object or an array or a string or whatever. It's a very odd configuration format. All right, output. We know output. Output's easy. Output's literally the output of what Webpack is going to print out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say path is path.join. Remember the path module that we imported up there. Path.join dirname source, or sorry, what am I doing? Dirname public build. So again, remember, I said this in the last video. Public, and then there's going to be a folder under public called build, is where all of our built client code is going to go. So we have path, file name. Now we're do something weird here. I'm going to say name.js. Why am I doing this instead of doing what I did with the server? With the server, I just did server.js. Why am I doing this? Well, the answer is because we are going to have multiple files up here in our entry, we have to have the file name use this template string. And this is a special Webpack syntax that says, okay, whatever the name of the chunk was, print it out to that name. So as a result, this chunk right here, this application entry, will be named application because that's the name of that particular chunk or entry chunk. And then public path. We need a public path. We need a public path because the public path is what the browser is going to see that folder as. And because the browser, we're going to serve out the public folder using Express Static Middleware. So we need to tell Webpack where to expect the files from when we're in the browser. And so that's why we do /build, which will correlate to this folder right here from the browser's perspective. Remember, the browser doesn't see any of these top-level files. Browser only sees the public directory. So that's why we just have /build. All right, that's our output. Resolve. You remember resolve? This will actually be the exact same, almost the exact same, as our server. Remember, we want to be able to alias out shared to path.join dirname source shared. So this allows us to access our shared code, shared between the server and the client. And then we need our module loaders. So module and then loaders. Okay, this is going to be fun. And by fun, I mean not fun. So let's go ahead and do this. Okay, for loaders, remember, loaders are the things that transform our files. They need a test. And the test is, what files should this loader manipulate? The first test will be a regular expression that matches anything with a file extension of JavaScript. The loader will be Babel, or Babel loader, or whatever. Both will work. And then we're going to have an exclude for node module. So this should look familiar. In fact, this is, once I had that comma in there, this is the exact thing we had before with our server. Next up, test. And we're going to do ./js. You should know what's coming. Loader is going to be ESLint. So we're going to lint our server and our client code. And we're going to say exclude node modules. We don't want to lint node modules. That'd be silly. Next up, now this is going to be a fun one. Remember how I said Webpack can load practically anything, but you have to tell it about the things it can load. So remember that PNG that we added? Well, we need to tell Webpack how to load PNG files. So I'm going to do something nasty here. I'm going to say match anything with the extension of PNG or JPEG or JPEG with an E or GIF or WAF or TIFF or TTF or EOT or SVG or WAF2. And the loader is going to be URL loader with a limit of, let's do 512. And then we'll do our CSS loader and our Sass loader. And then finally, we'll say plugins equals plugins. But let's take a second and talk about this nasty thing we have going here. What this is telling Webpack is it's saying, if you find any file required in that is any of these extensions, use the URL loader. But then we're telling the URL loader, if the file is larger than 512 bytes, then use the file loader. Or, sorry, the other way around. The URL loader will inline images that are small, and we'll see an example of that in a moment here. But let's go ahead and run this real fast. If the video is getting a little long, I'll recap some of this stuff in the next video, but let's just make sure we don't have any errors. So node modules bin webpack config is client dot webpack. Nah, webpack. There, I can type. Good. Cannot file client webpack. .js. Cannot find client. Oh, webpack.client. Derp. I can spell. and it built. In the next video, we're going to talk about what exactly built and what went on with that, and more of this config stuff. So see you guys then.